insights into the whole issue of Gandhi and the making of modern India. We now move to the first panel of this morning session. And I'm really gratified to see a full hall. I think this is absolutely wonderful. The kind of response that there is today. You always hear that Gandhiji is no longer relevant to this generation. Obviously something totally untrue. I'm now invite Professor Purushottam Agarwal to come and give his talk. I think both the speakers are going to be speaking on the subject of Gandhiji for our times. So, Professor Purushottam Agarwal.
Professor Mahajan, Professor Mukherjee, distinguished and young historians present in this hall. It's indeed a privilege, actually an honor for me to be addressing this gathering in this august body of historians. Is it okay now? Can you hear me now? Is it okay now? Okay. So, it's indeed an honor to be speaking to you friends, particularly when one is not even a trained historian. I work on, but even if you are not a trained historian, history has something to do with you. You cannot escape history even if you are not a historian. And therefore, I think history is everybody's concern, and so it is mine concern also. About Gandhiji in our times, I would like to recall, if you were there in Professor Aditya Mukherjee's lecture last evening, presiding over that, Professor Irfan Habib said that in 50s we had a certain kind of sense of history, we had a certain kind of curriculum for economic history of India. Now this seems to have changed, and now there are many who actually act as an apologist of the colonial system or the imperial system. Before proceeding further, this is important to note that the right-wing forces have not been in political power all these 70 years. So there is a moment of introspection also. They have been in power only occasionally, and now for last 5 years. So if this change of history, this sense of history has changed in last 70 years in the academic and the formal education, then there is a moment for introspection for people like us who claim to be democratic, liberals and progressives. But more importantly, Professor Irfan Habib rightly lamented the retreat of modern ideas. He said that we have taken leave of modernism, modern ideas also. I think today in 21st century, not only India, but the whole world is facing a situation which can be described as the retreat of modern ideas and enlightenment values. Quite naturally, therefore, this is the time of post-truth, this is the time of alternative facts, because this is the time of post-modernity. We are in a situation where all kind of narratives can be justified. Grand narrative is almost a sin. So everybody has his or her own truth, and every truth is equally valid. In such a situation, it's really not possible to condemn anything as not acceptable, because then everybody has his own or her own ideas, method and all that, and you cannot expect a universal method, you cannot expect a universal value system, which was the hallmark of enlightenment system. So this is one thing. Secondly, particularly in our own country, let us understand it very clearly that there have been, broadly speaking, 2 or 3 contesting ideas of India ever since we started thinking in terms of modern nation state. It is not for the first time that people are talking of a certain kind of idea of India. The Gandhian Nehruvian idea of India, which is defined by the ideals of inclusivity, democracy, and much maligned term or much misunderstood term secularism, has been challenged in past, and today let us face the fact that this idea of India has been challenged to a large extent very successfully. Many people have internalized the ideas of aggressive nationalism, bordering on jingoism. We are, courtesy electronic media particularly, we are a society which is in a constant state of excitement, if not anger. There is hardly any moment of calm reflection. There is hardly any moment of solitude in which you can think, you can talk to yourself, you can read something. There are studies which tell us that the attention span is going down dramatically. People don't want to focus on anything for more than a couple of minutes. And these situations are now reflecting in a situation where if you question the acts of the governments, you are described as anti-national. And you are described as anti-national not by the official establishment, by the political establishment, but by people at large. Let us face this. The media, which is supposed to ask the question, which is supposed to ideally speak truth to the power, has become the propaganda machine of power. So we are in such a situation, and therefore it is important to recognize that things are not very easy now. And why Gandhi becomes important in such situations. I have been interacting with Gandhi and Nehru for quite some time. And in fact, let me recall here, in my childhood and early youth, I also used to believe, like many of my contemporaries, and I'm sure this is something which every North Indian would be familiar with. We had an expression, Majburi ka naam Mahatma Gandhi. I'm sure all of you have heard it. So the idea was that if you cannot do anything, if you have no strength, you have no force, then go on hunger strike. After all, that is what Gandhiji used to do. So Majburi ka naam Mahatma Gandhi. I also used to believe that. By and by, when I started learning, when I started studying, I came to a very different conclusion. And 13 years ago, in 2005, I was invited to deliver the annual Gandhi lecture at Gandhi Peace Foundation, and I chose the title of my lecture, and the title was Majbuti ka naam Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is not the name of Majburi. So it's Majbuti ka naam Mahatma Gandhi. Because just as intolerance reflects the lack of faith in your own project, that is why I am intolerant, because I cannot convince you, and I know that I cannot convince you. Therefore, I just don't want to tolerate, I just don't want to enter into a dialogue with you. I just want to commit some kind of violence with you, verbal or physical or whatever. Similarly, and Gandhiji was saying this repeatedly, that non-violence is not the weapon of weak, it is the weapon of strong. Non-violence and cowardice are not synonymous. So when you are non-violent, it does not mean that you are coward, therefore you are non-violent. You are non-violent because you know, you have faith in the potential of dialogue, you have faith in the potential of non-violent action. When we talk of Gandhi for today, we must realize the originality of Gandhi. And the originality lies not in his apparent senatorial preferences or his actions, but in very thought system, in his very thinking. He used to say that when truth and non-violence, I am talking of truth and non-violence, I am not saying anything new. These things are as old as hills. This should not be taken literally. This should be taken only as a symbol of his humbleness, his humility. Because we all know that violence in some way or the other has been justified rationalized by all philosophical and religious systems. All systems make a distinction between holy violence and unholy violence. The violence committed in the favor of class is good violence, it is class violence, it is revolutionary violence. Violence committed from the point of view of my religiosity, my religious identity is good violence. We have an old Sanskrit saying, Vediki hinsa hinsa na bhavati. And the translation of this statement, cultural translation of this statement, can be found in all religious traditions. That violence is bad only when it is committed by the other or it is committed for petty ends. If I kill for personal reasons, I am violent. If I kill as part of a political project, then I am a martyr, or I am a soldier, or I am a class warrior. Gandhi, to my mind, to the best of my knowledge, is the first philosopher in human history which problematizes the idea of holy violence. And he raises the question that violence does not become good if it is committed by Indians. It remains bad even if it is committed by Indians. And let us also not think that he was so simple as not to realize the inevitability of violence in human life. In fact, in his autobiography, he notes very clearly that we cannot escape violence. Human existence is not possible without violence. Violence has to be there. The point, however, is that we must constantly strive towards compassion and restraint. Then we will have a non-violent temperament. He talks of non-violent temperament. He is also clear that non-violence does not mean to accept or to surrender before the villainy or in a situation of national crisis. But he raises the question that can there be a non-violent mass movement and still retain the sanity in society. These ideas, which were supposed to be fantastic, which were dismissed in his own lifetime by philosophers, people by and by realized, reflecting on the post-war Europe, philosopher Hannah Arendt noted that yes, violence changes society, but most of the times it turns society into a more violent one. So when you believe in social change through violence, you probably cannot expect a non-violent or a peaceful society as a result of such kind of social change. These insights into the nature of human being and the place of human being in cosmos are important. Because after all, without compassion, without thinking of the other, in these postmodern eras, the idea of cultural self is very important. And it ought to be, particularly on part of oppressed social and cultural identities. Everybody talks of self-assertion. But what kind of self-assertion would it be if it is not bothered about the other? As a human being, as a person, as a male, as a Savarn Hindu or whatever, as an Indian, if all I am concerned and obsessed with is myself, individual or cultural, then there is some problem. So there has to be some kind of compassion, some kind of thinking for the other. And there has to be restraint, whether in my relations with nature or my relations with other people. And therefore, friends, it's not only the question of everyday politics, it's not only the question of so-called secularism or lack of it. The point is that without this fundamental insight, I think Martin Luther King was prophetic when he said that the choice is not anymore between non-violence and violence. The choice now is confined to non-violence or non-existence. So there has to be some kind of, and what does it imply for today's India when we talk of all this? One thing more which I think is important for us to realize, there is a general perception that Gandhiji was a traditional man while Nehru was a modern man. And also, because of this, some people argue, some people try to take the position that somehow Gandhiji either committed or was made a fool of by some people, and he chose Jawaharlal Nehru, the modern man, instead of Sardar Patel, who was a traditional man. I mean, I don't know. These days, ignorance is the bliss. Not only it's a bliss, it's a privilege, it's a matter of honor. I don't know how many people realize that before joining politics, Sardar Patel, on all standards, was a much more modern man than Jawaharlal Nehru, in his personal habits and in his eating habits. So, the point, on a serious note, what do we mean by tradition and what do we mean by modernity? I mean, this is again a complete internalization of the American anthropology of 50s and 60s. When the question was, can India be a modern society? And the implicit assumption was that modernity means copying Western Europe. We must realize that every tradition has a potential of modernity, and every modernity has a tradition. It does not drop from the sky. European modernity does not drop from the sky. Indian modernity cannot but be a natural evolution of the diversity of Indian cultural experience, going back in history for thousands of years. And in that sense, how can you dismiss an idea merely because of its provenance? Gandhi was not that kind of India lover, but he was aware that maybe his language or his idiom or his behavior sometimes gives this impression. So he actually tried to clarify things, and many times, and at least at one place, he came back rather harshly on such people and on such critics. And I quote from Young India of October 1928, "I have nothing to be ashamed of if my views on ahimsa are the result of my Western education." The charge was that your glorification of non-violence is not part of Hindu tradition. Hindu tradition does not glorify non-violence this way, the way you do. So this is actually a import from West. This is the result of Christian sentimentalism. This is the result of Tolstoy and Thoreau and all that. It is in response to these kind of quote-unquote charges that Gandhiji is saying, "I have nothing to be ashamed of if my views on ahimsa are result of my Western education. I have never tabooed all Western ideas, nor I am prepared to anathematize everything that comes from the West as inherently evil." So this is, in a very philosophical, fundamental sense, to me, I am not merely talking of political situation, in a very basic existential sense, this approach is relevant to me. A similar, or rather complementary statement to this statement, I would like to recall that everybody knows Gandhiji was a very religious man, and in fact he used to call himself as a Sanatani Hindu, and used to declare his faith in Murti Puja and his love for Gau Mata, though he made it very clear that I believe in Go Seva and not Go Raksha. He made a distinction between these two. And I'm pretty sure if he were alive today, he would be going on an indefinite fast, not in favor of Gau, but against the Go Rakshaks. I'm pretty sure of this. And for this would be described as he was as essentially anti-Hindu. Before coming to this point, let me just remind this audience that Nathuram Godse was not a madman. Let us be very clear about it. He was an extremely articulate man. He was very clear in his political ideas. And if you read his statement, again, he sort of concedes his weakness when he says that because of this, I thought that Mahatmaji is wrong. But nobody could argue with him. He was not bothered. He was not concerned with Hindus at all. He was all doing whatever he was doing for Muslims, and he was obsessed with Muslim interest and all that. And yet, Hindus were following him like anything. And I quote Godse verbatim. I realized that the moral influence of this man cannot be resisted, and therefore he has to be removed. This is Godse. He knew that as long as he is around, the ideas of Hindu Rashtra, the ideas of Hindustan only for Hindus are not going to find acceptance even amongst the ordinary people. And this moral strength, this moral influence, apart from his long political career and social career and his insistence on taking social and political issues together, be it untouchability, be it communal question, be it the question of the plight of women in India. It was because of all this, but all this was because of his fundamental position, one part of which we have just seen, that no idea can be dismissed or accepted merely on the basis of its provenance. You have to judge the idea. You have to have a basic moral parameter in your mind, and on the basis of that you have to judge an idea, a practice, a proposal, a system, or whatever. Gandhiji, as I was telling you, was a Hindu, a very सहज Hindu. वो ना ये कहा करते थे कि मुझे हिंदू होने पे गर्व है, और ना ये कहा करते थे कि मुझे हिंदू होने पे शर्म है, क्योंकि वो जानते थे कि जो फैसला आपका नहीं है उस पर आप क्या गर्व करेंगे और क्या शर्म करेंगे। मैंने कोई दरखास्त तो दी नहीं थी अल्लाह मियाँ को कि मुझे हिंदू बनिया घर में पैदा करना, तब इसमें मैं क्या गर्व करूंगा, क्या शर्म करूंगा। अगर मुसलमान बना देते तो मैं मुसलमान होता। हाउ कुड आई हेल्प इट? एनीवे, so Gandhi knew this intuitively. And on the question of untouchability, when he was challenged, and the Brahmin scholars in Kerala actually refused to engage with him because he was not even authorized to talk about Shastras, because he was a Baniya after all. Only a Brahmin could discuss Shastras. They refused to engage with him. Gandhi in such situations made one thing very clear, and he gave his basic moral parameter categorically. He said that anything from any scripture will not be acceptable to me if it violates the spirit of this particular mantra from Ishavasya Upanishad. That mantra provided him, or that mantra articulated for Gandhi his basic moral scale, moral parameter. And the mantra, my friends, and I'll close with this, is something like this. ईशावास्यम इदम सर्वम यत किंच जगत्याम जगत तेन त्यक्तेन भुंजीथा मागृत कस्य स्विद्धनम. This whole world is permeated by divine presence. You have a right to it, but you only have a limited right. Enjoy your right and never try to encroach upon the rights of others. They also have right to dignity. They also have right to natural sources. Gandhi is categorical, and he says that I oppose untouchability because I believe in this. This is my moral parameter. And if any Hindu scripture supports untouchability, I will reject that Hindu scripture on the basis of this mantra from Ishavasya Upanishad. And this is not only about Hindu scripture, it can be a Christian scripture, Muslim scripture, whatever. Gandhi here, this is my last point, ma'am. Gandhi here is making an essentially modern statement. He is saying that this is my individuality, my discretion, my vivek, on the basis of which I will take decision. He is not following the tradition because it is tradition. He is judging it on the basis of his knowledge, his concerns, his perception of the world, and is making a deliberate moral and epistemological choice. And this is a modern choice. The mind making such a choice is a modern mind, even if it is not the result of European modernity exclusively. On that, I have my own ideas, and I don't think that pre-British India was lacking in modernity absolutely. It had its own evolution of its own kind of modernity, but this is not the time to discuss all that. But I believe that Gandhi and Nehru are relevant today, not merely as statesmen, not merely as the articulate spokespersons of the idea of India, democratic idea of India, but also as the specimen of most engaging intellectual endeavor with both tradition and modernity. And that is what Gandhi means for me today. Thank you.
Yes. I think we all agree that this was an absolutely fascinating lecture that Purushottam gave us this morning. And in his usual style, where, you know, there is a mixture of deep insight, but with the very apt rhetoric, you know, which we always associate with him to make his points very clearly. What I'll just flag very quickly in 1 or 2 minutes some of the main points that he made, because this would help the discussion later on. I thought one very important issue was how he took the debate beyond secularism and its critics to a very different plane. Professor Agarwal began with his own journey and his own understanding of Gandhi as a young person, and reminded us of a time when, as he said, Gandhiji meant, you know, Majburi ka naam Mahatma Gandhi, but very importantly gave us a new phrase. I would say this journey from Majburi to Majbuti. I think this is the title for your book, I think, on, if I may propose it on...
Lecture is already published.
Okay. All right. I thought I was proposing the title of the new book, but I'm sure the essay can be expanded into a book. What I found very interesting was the critique of alternative facts, postmodernism, post-truth, and locating it in that era, which we all recognize is a very big intellectual challenge to us today. Another very important point was about the obsession with self and identity and assertion of self, very often masquerading as a rights discourse when it comes to communities and identities. And I think you did very well, sir, to remind us of that. On the subject of the Nehru-Patel relationship and the way it has been distorted today, particularly in the public discourse, again, Professor Agarwal took our understanding beyond the simplistic notions of tradition, defined in a certain way of lifestyle, etc., and the way you live, to and modernity again of a simplistic kind. And last but not least, I think the whole understanding of Gandhiji on non-violence that you gave us, where you reminded us that Gandhiji had said at one point that if non-violence has come from my Western education, I have no problem with that. I think this is a very apt reminder, because in the literature on the subject, there is too much of a tendency, if I may say so, to ascribe non-violence to the Jain upbringing and to Gandhiji's Sanatan Dharma, his Vaishnav thing. So to bring this element in, because there is no doubt in my mind that in the later years of his life, a period that I've spent some years in studying, that a lot of his vocabulary came from Christianity. When he used to fast, he would talk about crucifixion of the flesh. And there are many such things, but I'm not going to take your time at all on this. I now invite Professor Mridula Mukherjee to come and talk to us on Gandhiji and our times. We'll take questions and comments together. Right, because the theme is the same. Is that all right with you, sir?
And for
Thank you.
another reason as well, which I'll confess.
Okay.
Well, friends, the first thing I want to say is that if you, as you will see, notice a lot of similarity between Purushottam's talk and mine, it is because we have together breathed the pure anti-national air of JNU for many decades together. And you know, it somehow does something to you, and you begin to think in certain ways which you can't get out of, you know. So here we are. So bear with us if we repeat ourselves before you. So, for the sake of brevity and shortage of time, I will stick to the text rather than speak extempore, because when I tend to do that, I take very long. So,
But if they are working, this is more important, because they have conveyed that they are working on such and such image or such and such pillar.
incomplete without his glasses in one corner. Bharat no longer can be made Swachh without his help. Arundhati Roy